Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 5. It took most of the first week of her stay on the Ramshorn estate for Raelle to properly assess the house and the grounds. Once everything she wanted to have installed was outlined on the map, she took the foreman of the security installation crew on a tour of the property. As they finished their rounds, and the foreman promised to have the first crew begin the next day, Raelle was distracted by the sound of soft jazz music. She shook the man's hand and left him to find his way back to his vehicle while she followed the sound of music. Raelle found herself on one of the many winding stone footpaths that led to the various buildings dotting along the grounds a little ways from the main house. She stepped up to the French doors and peered inside. Byron was sitting on a stool in an open area, working at an easel. She rapped lightly at the door with her knuckles and his head popped up from the canvas. He gave her a small wave, and she stepped inside. "So this is your studio?" Raelle asked. "Yes, my own little artistic domain," Byron answered, gesturing around at the various canvases. Raelle knew next to nothing about art, but from what she could see, she assumed that Scylla's brother was just as popular in the art world as Scylla was in the music industry. As she looked around, Byron stood proudly. When she stepped up to one wall that displayed a series of portraits of a man and a woman and a young girl, Byron moved beside her. "That's our parents, and that was Scylla when she was 15. I painted it less than a year before they died." Raelle looked at Byron, sympathy in her eyes. "I lost my mom a couple of years ago. She was a medic in the army." Before she could stop herself, she found herself telling Byron everything. About her anger, about her locking herself in her dad's house. She didn't know why, but she felt this Ramshorn was a bit of a kindred spirit. After she finished, Byron gazed sadly at the portraits and then gestured over at several canvases depicting an odd mixture of patriotic flags and various plants. One painting displayed the American flag, the pole covered in climbing vines and white roses. Our father was a dignitary, and mother was a botanist. "Someone who studies plants?" Raelle asked. "Yes, I know you asked about them earlier." Raelle's brows lifted and Byron smiled, ready to tell the blonde his story. "A lot of people don't know much about our family. They were fairly private and my father's job, well, delicate to say the least. He had a lot of political sway in these parts, but that also made him a lot of enemies. We sort of kept to ourselves. Anyway, most people just assumed that Scylla bought this place with her money from her music career, but our parents actually bought it a couple years before they were killed. Scylla and I inherited it." "So all the plants," Raelle began. "Yes, our mother planted most of them." Raelle nodded, finally understanding the brunette's strange obsession with the foliage. It also made sense now why everything in the house seemed to be at least a decade old. It was obvious things had been left the way they were when the Ramshorn's parents died. "You said they were killed?" Raelle asked. Byron nodded. "It was a terrible accident. They were run off the road by a drunk driver." "I'm sorry," Raelle said, the response automatic. "And I'm sorry about your mother," Byron answered. "Scylla never quite got over what happened," the lanky man continued. She just threw herself into her music. About 6 months after they died, she came out with her first major hit, and here we are. Raelle nodded. Stepping away from the art display, she moved toward the canvas that Byron had been working on. It was a male nude, and Raelle could see that it was of a man the brunette obviously admired. "And what about you?" the blonde asked. Byron shrugged, a sad smile on his face. "Scylla turned away from love, and I've been running toward it for a while now." Raelle nodded, understanding the brunette a little better now. She'd been avoiding connection like the plague since she'd lost her mother, but eventually her friends helped her through most of the pain. Byron was right. Love was the answer. She knew it, even if she wasn't ready to do anything about it. After leaving Byron to his art, Raelle stepped back onto the path and almost ran right into Helen, who practically bounced on the balls of her feet, excited to learn some driving moves. "I thought we were doing that next week," Raelle asked, teasing the brunette. "You promised today." "I've got to check those temporary cameras," Raelle said, and started walking in the opposite direction of the garage. Helen darted in front of the blonde and tossed an arm around the bodyguard, practically dragging her to the garage. "Okay," Raelle answered, laughing at her assistant and allowing herself to be pulled along by the taller woman. "I guess I can show you how to do a 180-degree skid turn." Helen practically whooped in excitement beside her, and Raelle laughed as they entered the garage and made their way over to the limo. A couple of hours later, Raelle gritted her teeth and held on to the old shit bar as Helen jerked the limo around, following the blonde's instructions. Scylla and Byron lounged by the pool, soaking up the last of the season's warm summer sun. Soon, they would have to close the outdoor pool for the fall and winter. The mansion had an indoor pool, but Scylla preferred being outside among her plants. She was relaxing on her stomach, letting the heat seep into her back, and enjoying the company of her brother, whom she had finally pulled away from his precious canvas, when sound of tires squealing abruptly roused her from her rest, and she lifted herself up on her elbows and looked towards the sound. At the sight of her brand-new limousine being looped around the drive at extremely high speed, she growled, "What the fuck is she doing now?" Byron turned his head, squinting up at his sister. "Who?" "Raelle, do you hear what she's doing to my fucking car?" Scylla hissed. Stifling a yawn, Byron responded, "She's teaching Helen defensive driving." Wait, how do you know that?" "Helen mentioned it to me this morning at breakfast. She was really excited about it." Offended that she was the last to know, Scylla muttered, "Raelle should have asked me first." "Well, she got it all cleared with Isadora." Scylla rolled her eyes. "Helen is so damn infatuated with her that she'll go along with any harebrained idea Raelle has, won't she?" Byron smirked. "Sounds like somebody's jealous. Besides, it was Helen's idea." Scylla glared at her brother. "Jealous of what?" "Of all the attention that Raelle is giving Helen, and all the attention that Helen is giving back to your bodyguard." Scylla snorted in reply. "You like Raelle, admit it." "Hell no." "Yes." You think she's sexy, though," Byron prodded in a sing-song voice. "To the point of getting off in the shower just thinking about her." Scylla blushed at her thought. "Well, yes, she has an amazing body. You'd have to be blind to not see that. She's beautiful." Scylla looked over at her brother and added, "Or, be a gay guy. But she's not my type." "You mean she's got the brains to stay far away from you?" Scylla's brows shut up in surprise, and she turned to look at her brother. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Byron shrugged. "Well, I mean that you aren't her type." Scylla furrowed her brows. "She's not into guys, is she?" "If she is, my gator is seriously broke beyond repair," she thought. Byron laughed. "Nah, she's totally a little gay puppy." "So exactly why aren't I her type?" Scylla repeated again. "Well, you're her client," Byron offered lamely. He thought back to the conversation that he'd had with the blonde in his studio, but it wasn't a conversation he felt he had permission to share. Luckily, Byron was saved from further interrogations from his little sister by a loud squealing of tires that came from the drive. Helen must have misjudged the turn. "Son of a bitch," Scylla shouted. She stood up from her lounge chair and stomped towards the driveway. At the local FBI headquarters, Raelle handed the envelope over to the guard for inspection and checked her gun. Beyond the metal detectors, Tally Craven stood, barely containing her excitement. After the severe-looking guard handed the envelope back to Raelle along with a visitor's pass and instructions to not lose the receipt for her gun, the blonde walked up to her friend. They exchanged awkward glances for a moment, trying to decide which would win out, the need for professionalism or their need to hug one another. The redhead made up her mind and swept the blonde into a tight hug. The guard watched, a little excitement injected into his otherwise boring routine. He'd heard a few rumors about the redhead, and it was as plain as day that the blonde was a lesbian. Maybe the redhead was too. This little intel would certainly give him an advantage in the betting pool that Alder and Craven had a little something going on other than late-night mentoring sessions. He'd have to raise his bet. Raelle grinned, oblivious to the guard's interest. "It's good to see you, Tal." She let her eyes look over her best friend's tall form. "You look so serious in that suit." "I know," Tally pouted. "Miss Agent Craven," Raelle teased. "I like it." Tally smiled. "And look at you in that suit. Private work must be paying you well." Raelle blushed. "Well, I'll admit, I picked up a couple of new outfits when I took the job." "The ram's horns don't go to Denny's." Tally laughed. "You look great, Ray. Let's go up to Sarah's floor." "Sarah?" Raelle teased. "Since when does Miss Special Agent in Charge, Sarah Alder, become just Sarah?" Now Tally was the one blushing, her face turning as red as her hair. She was saved having to explain, though, by the number of people in the elevator when the doors opened. They stepped in and she pushed the button for all the way to the top, garnering a few glances from other agents. Once they got off the elevator, Raelle found herself alone with her friend again and she pushed for more information. "We're just friends, Ray," Tally sighed, leading her friend into a conference room where they settled to wait for the agent in charge. It was obvious to Raelle that Tally seemed a bit disappointed in the just part. "Well, here's a little something for you." She reached into her suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. Tally squealed as she took the envelope that Raelle offered her and opened it to see that it contained a picture with Scylla and the scribbled words, "With all my devotion, Scylla." "There's a couple of tickets in there for the Fort Salem concert, too. Maybe you can invite Sarah," Raelle teased. Tally's eyes widened and her jaw dropped open. "Ray, those tickets are like $500 a person." "Well, I know a girl," Raelle began, blushing. Tally squealed again and reached over to embrace her best friend. Special Agent in Charge Sarah Alder stepped in the conference room in that moment, and her brow furrowed at the young, boisterous agent and her blonde friend. "Miss Caller, you are here to talk to us about Scylla Ramshorn?" "Yes, ma'am," Raelle answered, straightening up in her chair. "Show us what you have," the agent said, taking the seat at the head of the table. Raelle opened the manila envelope and spilled the contents onto the conference table. An hour later, Special Agent in Charge, Sarah Alder, wrapped up the meeting with Raelle and her young agent. She had promised Raelle all the resources that the FBI had to analyze the evidence she'd provided, and to have Tally get back to her when there were some results. Agent Craven walked Raelle out of the office and back to her Subaru, intent on sharing one more hug with her best friend before she headed back to Salem. "It will probably be a few weeks," Tally warned. "I understand," Raelle answered. "Just try to rush it as much as you can." "You really think she's in trouble, huh? You saw the evidence, don't you?" Tally thought back to the notes she'd looked at and the weird, creepy doll. The photos were still by far the most concerning thing, though. "Yeah, Ray," Tally admitted. "You need to be careful." "Always," Raelle answered as she stepped into her car. Byron grinned as he watched the blonde and his sister sizing each other up once they'd entered the restaurant. It was their typical Wednesday lunch with Byron's art friends, and as usual, he insisted that his sister came along. Now, nearly a month into her employment, that meant Raelle had to come too, and his friends, mainly a gaggle of girls, were instantly taken by the tough ex-military bombshell of a bodyguard. Helen must have warned her about the dress code of the location because she had dressed in a dark, charcoal suit, expertly tailored to fit her slender form. Her shirt underneath a pale pink. She wore dark heels instead of her customary military-style boots, and the extra 3 inches made her look even more dashing. As they walked inside the restaurant, he had noticed several female heads turn their way. His sister, who normally wore whatever looked skimpy to irk him in front of his friends, had dressed to impress this afternoon as well, and he had no doubt she was showing off for a certain blonde bodyguard. She wore a cobalt blue dress that hugged her curves and accented the look with simple gold jewelry. As Scylla passed Rael in the narrow doorway to the private dining area, she brushed her form up against the blonde and whispered in her ear, "Nice suit." The brunette's breath tickled at Rael's neck, and the blonde barely suppressed a shocked shudder at the instant twitch of desire that shut down her spine and straight to her center. She could still smell the light scent of sandalwood with earthy undertones as the brunette moved to take her seat beside Byron. Rael cleared her throat and shifted her position, her back slightly to the group as she planned to stand her guard over her client from the doorway. She blushed as Byron insisted that she join the group at the table and eat with them. Half an hour later, Byron's sides were sore from laughing, and he was pretty happy with himself that he'd finally invited the bodyguard to sit with them. She was friendly, engaging, and she had a quick wit that went along perfectly with her southern charm. So then Abigail shoved Tally and she stumbled back. All that rocking upset the boat, and the next thing you know, here we were in the water with 6 crocodiles surrounding us, and all we had were these teeny tiny little utility knives. As the bodyguard continued to gesture animatedly as she told her story, entertaining his friends, Byron watched Scylla watching Rael. It was obvious from her gaze that his little sister had it bad. Once the story ended, there were shouts from his friends for another one, but Rael politely declined sitting back in her chair and sipping her coffee. Byron started a tale of his own, and Rael and Scylla found themselves ducking out of the conversation. Rael's pale blue eyes met Scylla's gaze, and she flashed the brunette a soft grin. The smile fell when she felt something under the table running up the length of her calf. She gave the brunette a withering glare. Scylla winked at her bodyguard, but gave the blonde a brief reprieve and moved her foot. Rael let out a relieved breath when Scylla's foot left her calf, but nearly spit her coffee out a moment later when she felt the same healed foot brush against her inner thigh and press against her center. Scylla met the blonde's withering glare with a soft smirk, daring the blonde to react. Rael's sense of duty was quickly outweighed by the 1-2 punch of her growing arousal and her stubbornness to never back down from a challenge. The 2 glasses of wine she'd had during lunch probably hadn't helped either. Still sipping her coffee, she slipped her other hand under the table and grasped the heel foot in her lap. As Scylla's breath caught in response to her action, Rael began lightly caressing her ankle with her long, slender fingers. She slid the bottom of her palm up further, massaging her calf in her lap in a lazy circular motion. As the brunette hid a moan behind her napkin, Rael winked at the musician and mouthed, "Had enough?" Scylla met the blonde's gaze, blue eyes darkening with desire. Rael's response to her little flirtation was better than she could have imagined, and the fact that Byron and his art friends droned on, oblivious to what was going on under the table, only turned her on more. She gave a slight shake of her head. "Keep going," the brunette mouthed back, encouraging the blonde. Rael moved her hand away, much to the brunette's displeasure, and stood up. She excused herself, saying she needed to have the limo moved as everyone finished up with their desserts. As Rael left the dining area, she could feel Scylla's eyes follow her out the door. Byron looked over at his sister and noticed a somewhat strange expression on her face. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his friends talking among themselves as they began to settle up the bill. "Yeah," Scylla rasped. "Just peachy. Thanks ever so much for lunch." Scylla said her own goodbyes and stepped out to the front of the restaurant where Rael stood, arms folded across her chest, eyes on the door and crowd that had surrounded the walkway to the limousine. "They knew you'd be here," Rael said, no hint of their previous flirtation or the reaction it had caused visible on her face. The hot and cold was a shock to the brunette, but she shrugged, pressing down her own arousal. "We eat here every few weeks, so it wasn't much of a reach." The blonde answered, but offered no further comment. On the way out, Rael insisted on walking a few steps in front of Scylla. When a girl shot forward from the side of the crowd, Rael instinctively put a hand out to restrain the girl. Scylla looked down at the girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, and back at Rael. The girl's mother stepped up and apologized, and Scylla spoke before her bodyguard could. "No, it's not a problem at all," she crouched down. coming to the girl's eye level, and talked to her for a few minutes while the blonde watched, slightly embarrassed at her response. It had been instinctual, but far too extreme for the circumstance. The musician had her emotions all over the place, and she once again had to remind herself to get it together. Scylla stood and invited the girl and her mother to take a picture. She handed Byron the phone, who stepped in front of them and took the shot. He handed the phone back to the mother, and she left with her little girl still excitedly talking about the encounter. Scylla frowned at Rael as she stepped up to the limo. "You gonna shoot them next time?" Rael cringed but said nothing and got into the front of the limo beside Helen. The driver didn't say anything, but Porter, who had watched the entire exchange from the car, snorted at Rael. "Hot-shot bodyguard, huh? Nothing like pushing around a kid." Helen looked over at Rael and offered her a consolatory smile. "How was lunch?" "Spicy," Rael answered without further comment. Helen chuckled as she pulled away from the curb. Rael watched her passenger door mirror, her eyes catching a dark black sedan pull out and follow the limousine. As Helen shifted into another lane, Rael watched the car do the same. "You know, caller, you need to understand something," Porter said, still annoyed with the bodyguard and the way she was upsetting Scylla. "What's that?" Rael asked, voice flat as she continued to keep her attention on the car. "I love Scylla, and I'm here for her comfort, her pleasure." Rael's brow quirked at his choice of words, but she kept her eyes on the mirror. "I'm not some hired cold fish with a gun determined on making her life miserable." "Sure, Porter," Rael answered. "I let her do what she wants, and I stand by if she needs help." "Good to know, Porter." "You could learn a lot from me, caller." Rael snorted and looked at Helen. Helen met Rael's gaze and looked in her rearview mirror, spotting the sedan. "Is that him?" "Maybe," Rael answered. "What's going on?" Potter asked. "Should I speed up?" Helen offered, foot hovering over the gas pedal. "No. Go as slow as you can to the gate, and then once I'm out of the car, punch it." "Okay," Helen answered, following Rael's instructions. As soon as the car slowed enough for Rael to get out of the gate, she jumped from the car and watched as the sedan behind them squealed its tires as the driver peeled out. Rael took off after it, running along the edge of the property, trying to find a spot to jump out in the road. Each time Rael thought she had the car, the damn shrubbery got in her way, pulling at her clothes and tearing her suit. She finally found a break in the greenery and jumped into the road, just missing the car. She got a couple of numbers from the license plate, and she knew it was an early 2000s Toyota Camry from the emblem on the trunk and the body style. Had she only been a few minutes quicker, though, she might have had the entire situation resolved. Damn the fucking foliage. Rael was sick of it, and she intended to have something done about it. Scylla was perched on the piano bench in her studio, working on a song idea inspired by the recent lunch outing she'd had with Rael in attendance, when she was interrupted by what sounded like a chainsaw, and I thought the installation was about complete. Shaking her head, her hands moved to the keys, and she tried to pick up where she'd left off, humming out loud the melody in her head. A loud crash made her jump, and her hands slammed down on the piano keys. Walking to the other end of the room, she looked out of the window, and her eyes widened as she watched several workmen with chainsaws attacking the trees that ran along the border of her property. As another pine fell, Scylla felt her temper rise, and she stalked out of the studio, slamming the door shut behind her. "What the fuck, Isadora?" Scylla asked, yelling at her manager as soon as she walked into the living area, summoned by Scylla's call. "Scylla, you knew this had to be done." "I didn't tell her she could cut my damn trees." "They are just trees, Scylla," Isadora said. "They were here long before your family ever moved here. And do you know, she wants Byron to change the day he has lunch just so my fans can't find us?" Rael stepped into the room, and Scylla turned her anger on the blonde. "Are you trying to control my entire fucking life?" "No, I'm trying to protect it," Rael began. "By destroying my property and telling me when and where I can go places?" Scylla asked. "It's prudent to. Are you going to tell me who I can fuck next?" Scylla yelled, interrupting the bodyguard. Rael's temper flared, and she began shouting back at the brunette, until Byron trotted in the house from his studio after Isadora sent him an SOS via text. The lanky man talked to both of them, mediating the dispute and liberally applying his ram's horn charm until both left the room, still angry, but at a temporary truce. Isadora shook her head at Byron after the girls left, and he laughed nervously. What are we going to do with these two? I don't know, the manager answered. I knew that there would be friction, but I didn't expect this much. No, those two have it bad for each other. Yes, Isadora agreed. Byron looked at the manager. Does Raelle know about tonight? No, Isadora answered. Garrett said she wanted to keep it under wraps until the last minute, even from her bodyguard. You know, after the luncheon the other day, Raelle would object to Beltane. She's been firm about checking out every location prior to Scylla having a concert there. Byron nodded. True, but I have a feeling this will be a shit show. Me too, Isadora agreed. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own, and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.